Okay, so everyone, this next episode is actually a audience topic. And it was, why don't we speak Navajo? And I guess the simple, short, 2-minute answer to that is, I was never taught Navajo. The end. I don't speak Navajo because I can't speak Navajo. And that's the simplest, shortest answer to that.
And we have a few questions related to that. So, for me, I speak some Navajo, but I'm not the kind of person that can have a long conversation with you. Like, we can have a back and forth, but it's going to be probably, like 50% Navajo, 50% English. If I don't know what is being said or asked of me, I will ask, can you explain that, in English to me? And because most people can speak English now, like my grandma could speak some English. I know a lot of elders can speak English. They just choose not to. They don't want to. Like my kids, Great Nellie used to say, I don't want that taste of English in my mouth. But I know a lot of people can speak English. They can understand it. They just choose not to. And so I like to have these back and forths. I can pray in Navajo. I can sing in Navajo. I understand, ceremonial protocol. I've taken classes at Dana College and at NAU and at UA. So, I have that. But I wouldn't say that I'm not like a 100% fluent speaker. You know what I mean? So that's where I'm at. And the reason why I don't speak Navajo as much on YouTube is because I know the majority of our audience speak English, and I want to be cognizant of that. Plus, because English is my first language, I feel like I can express myself more eloquently in English as opposed to stumbling through the Nepazad. Right?
And she wouldn't be able to talk to me because I can't speak.
Yeah, and so it's out of respect, for Kelsey and for others. That's why. That's my answer. But we have some questions here.
Okay,
and I think we should go into your question first.
Okay.
Should I ask it and you answer?
Okay, so but one thing, like for me, I've taken Navajo classes in school, obviously. I've taken I didn't take when you're required to take another language class in high school, I didn't go with Spanish. I went with German because, that's my mom's dad's family is from Germany and
I'm not Cardenas, so I took Spanish.
But no, that's why I took German.
Yeah.
And it was offered at the high school I went to. But I've noticed I'm not really good at learning a new language. And that might be for multiple reasons. Like some people, they can pick up multiple languages right off the bat, they get it and everything. But me, it doesn't click right away. I need to be able to talk the way I want to talk. And even my English, it's not perfect. I'll say things and I'll make up words and expressions to talk the way I want to speak and be able to express the way I want to speak. And with Navajo, I feel like everything I've heard, it's really it can be really rigid in the way you say things and how things are spoken. And maybe that's put me off from it, but also I was never taught it properly growing up. And my mom lived with her dad, who is of German descent, and so she never grew up learning the language. She didn't learn it. And then my dad, he spoke Navajo with with his mom and his siblings and everyone, but he never taught us. So, and everyone says, oh, it's best to learn from someone who speaks it growing up. I was like, but I didn't learn that growing up, so I guess I'm...
Yeah.
And that's always been, the response from people. I was like, oh, can you teach me Navajo? I was like, oh, well, you gotta grow up learning it. It's like, well, I guess I'm done.
It's, because you have to, what they say is you have to learn how to think in the Nepazad. And when you can... You need the language, you need the exposure to the language to start understanding the rhythms of the language, the pronunciation, all the different techniques and how to use your mouth muscles so that you can speak this language, because it is unique. It's very unique. And so there's that. But then as you start to absorb the language, you start to think in the language. Your perspective changes. The way you see the world is different. That's a fact. It's proven. And I think that's really meaningful and important and beautiful. But what happens is when you don't have that exposure, then you're going to start thinking in English. You're going to start speaking in English. You're going to use those muscles. And after a period, like, because they say a child is a sponge and they can absorb so much up to a point, and then after that it changes. And we're both beyond that point. You know what I mean? And so it takes it would take an immersive experience, I think, for that to happen. But the fact is, we live in a world now where that's not really it's either not possible or it's not plausible. That's where we're at right now. And you know, when I was growing up, like, my household, my mom, she is a fluent speaker. Like, she grew up speaking the language. That was her first language. Both her parents spoke it, but they didn't just speak Navajo. My grandma also spoke Apache, Hopi, and a little bit of English. And so knowing multiple languages was the norm because of trading reasons. You know what I mean? Like, they had livestock and like fields, and so they would she would communicate with people from other tribes on a regular basis. So because of commerce, you know, it was a good tool to have. So my mother grew up in that household, like in a hogan, you know, dirt floor hogan, very, very, like, the ideal situation. And then she gets sent off to placement in California. And this was during the, you know, in the 70s. So she gets sent off like a lot of people did. They got sent off to placement. She ended up in the Los Angeles area. Other people ended up in different regions. The history of that, there's a lot of trauma tied to that time, where you uproot children from their homes and their homeland, and you send them off to live with strangers to get an education in a foreign education. It was an assimilation practice that was mandated by the U.S. government. It was not their choice. It was something that was imposed on them.
Not everyone.
Well, in my family it was. So for that reason, there were some things that went on there as far as, like, when the acculturation and assimilation process started to happen. It affected my mother on a very deep level, and what it did is it instilled a lot of shame in her as far as her identity, her fluency, her ability to speak both languages well, and she had an accent that she used to get made fun of for. And it just turned into this whole thing. I think it was very ingrained deeply because she was, you know, this happened when she was very young. So she grew up with that. And what it resulted in is when she married my father, his first language was English, and he actually learned Navajo from her. And so he, you know, I think fluency falls on a spectrum, you know, where she's fully fluent and he's kind of like, you know, on the spectrum leading up to it. But he still goes between both languages. When it came to us, their children, our first language was English because they spoke to us in English. They did not take us into ceremony. They did not sing songs to us in Dinepazad. So while I was learning all these things, because I was literally like a sponge. I was learning so much at once, but it was all in English, and it was all stuff from the Bible too. Like, my first words literally were like some of the first words in my vocabulary were all the books in the Bible. I knew all these different like children's church songs, you know what I mean, and stories, and I could recite them, and it was nuts. And so, like, that was me growing up, you know, where growing up in the church, growing up with parents that mostly spoke English, and they only spoke Navajo to each other. It wasn't so much to us. And when they did speak to us, it was mostly just like ordering us around the house to, like, clean, you know what I mean, or do our chores or whatever. But it wasn't, and sometimes they would lecture us, but this was like in high school, way beyond the point where, you know, so our vocabularies are very limited, our exposure is very limited, therefore the bulk of our knowledge when it comes to language and fluency is in English. because that was the majority of what everyone else was speaking around us, including in school.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like my background as far as like my exposure and my learning journey, I guess.
Yeah. So we want to go into the questions?
Yes.
Okay. So one question I had was, does the current Navajo language curriculum in grade school work? So on the Navajo Nation, you take Navajo language class, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Navajo culture class. And I feel like it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because I first came back to the reservation and went to those schools in 3rd grade.
Mm-hmm.
And from 3rd grade all the way until like high school, I was learning the exact same thing. I learned my colors, I learned the numbers up to 10, and then I learned my clans.
Yeah.
Those were the only things they ever taught us.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same thing every rinse and repeat every year.
It's like that in college too.
It never expanded beyond
Mm-hmm.
those things. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
3rd grade, numbers, colors, clan. 4th grade, numbers, colors, clan. 5th grade, numbers, colors, clan. It's like there's nothing else to learn.
Yeah.
And they weren't very, I don't know, creative in the way they teach language. And like, I feel like my mom was a part of the school system and everything, and so I'd hear some of the teachers talking and like the Navajo teachers, and like their excuse was, well, kids just don't want to learn language. They don't absorb the language, you know, easily, or these words are too complicated for them to say because all they do is English. And with my daughter, watching her grow up, I call BS on all of that.
Yeah.
Because my little one, she watched Kung Fu Panda when she was really little. And she's like, oh, Master Oogway. I'm like, that's a really complicated word, you would think, to try and say. And it's like, the phonics of it is just as complicated as some of the Navajo words.
Yeah.
So if kids are constantly exposed to these words and these names and these pronunciations, they pick it up really easily. Like even now with Encanto coming out, she says all these little Spanish words. I'm like, if there were movies and shows and people willing to make these Navajo shows and Navajo cartoons and make them interesting and fun, and not just, oh, here's our colors, blah 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 blah. Like, no, this is a story, and they relate and connect better to these characters' names and things going on in the story. They'll want to learn the words better. And I feel like sometimes when I try to make some of like the movies in Navajo, I always get like these translators like, oh, well, that story, we don't use these words, or don't use the Navajo language for profit, or all these other things, and people get really,
there's just all these barriers.
they get really sensitive and gatekeepery about the Navajo language. Yeah, so like kids, they can pick up language and complicated words and phonics of things if they're constantly being surrounded and immersed by it. And I know people are like, oh, you should teach her Navajo, you should teach your daughter Navajo, and blah blah. It's like, I can't teach her Navajo. You can teach her Navajo. Like, I always tell my uncle who speaks Navajo, I'm like, speak to her Navajo, talk to her in Navajo, so she learns it. And they just don't.
I know, I do that too. I always tell people, speak to my kids in Dinepazal, let them figure it out. They need the exposure. I can't provide that to them, you know, the way you can. And guess what? They don't. They always go back to English, and I'm just like,
It's like
why are you lecturing me if you're not going to
right? It's like they yell at you for not knowing Navajo, but it's like, okay, can you teach my daughter Navajo because she's at the right age that you say she needs to learn it? And they're like, no. It's like, and this is why we don't.
So my eldest son and my daughter, their father is fluent. His first language was Navajo. He didn't learn English till 3rd grade. And guess what? He didn't speak to his kids in Navajo. He could have taught them from day one. You know what I mean? That's frustrating to me.
Yeah, and then like you get other people from all over. It's like, why don't you speak Navajo? And like they judge you for it. It's like, well, I was never taught Navajo. It's not my fault. I'm like, well, you can go learn it now. It's like, well, are you gonna teach me? That's something you have to learn.
Are you gonna pay for the classes? Are you gonna, you know what I mean? Like,
it's
it
not
takes
even
time.
just paying for the classes.
For me, it is.
It's
I'm
like,
just like.
Because then every time I retort, I'm like, well, can you teach me Navajo? And then they go, oh, well, it's something you have to grow up with. I'm like, well, then why are you yelling at me for it?
Like, you just answered your question. Oh, gosh. I know, and I feel like a lot of those movies now that are integrating other languages, that's relatively new. You know, like, I I'm older than Kelsey. I grew up in the 80s. Everything was all English, it seemed like. You know what I mean? Like, my exposure to the English language was so intense. It was in all of the media. And so you pair that with my exposure at home, and then you come at me and ask me, why don't you speak Navajo on YouTube in 2022? And I'm here to say, because I wasn't taught, but also it's not my fault. These were choices made by the people in my life, you know, who decided not to teach me. Thankfully, there were a few people that were very adamant about trying. Like, my aunt, my grandma. My grandma, like, rarely ever spoke English to me. It was like, if we're going to have a conversation, it's going to be in Navajo, and you need to figure it out. You know, and we were able to do that. Sometimes we couldn't, though. We would just look at each other and start laughing because I'm just like, she was like, oh my God. And my Nellie, one time, she really got after me. She just, like, went off the rails and, you know, like, what's wrong with you? You know what I mean? Like, she called us stupid. It was so sad. But we're just like, you know, like, we're sorry. Like, get after our dad. It's his fault, you know?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So anyways.
It's like my Nellies and my grandmas, they never got mad at me for not speaking Navajo. But like my Nellie, she can kind of understand English, but she doesn't really speak it very well. So I always remember me and her, we just kind of just like sit there and look at each other.
Yeah.
And it's like, I love you, you love me.
I would just hold her hand. I'd be like, I love you, Grandma, I'm sorry. You know?
And yeah, it's like we just, we can't communicate at all.
Also, something to what you were saying about curriculum. So when I was in grade school, when I was in kindergarten, all like K through 12, there weren't Navajo classes available. Yeah, so you had access to them, but I didn't. I remember culture class where we would make like a hogan out of popsicle sticks, and they would like teach us a few things like about like objects, you know, like moccasins and skirts and, you know, things like basic stuff about culture, not the actual cultural teachings, just like, it was very like if you got an encyclopedia and opened it to Navajo, it was like that. It wasn't really like the real deal. And then the language classes, what they did with us is they actually separated Navajo speakers from English speakers. So there were all these English speaking classes, and there was one Navajo class, and they were on their own. They were separate. We weren't integrated. That's how it was when I was going to school. And then when I had access to learn another language, which was in high school, I chose Spanish because I knew that was one of the most spoken, like one of the largest spoken languages in America, especially in the Southwest in California. And because I am not Cardinal, like I said, and I want to go to Spain one day. I want to go to South America one day. I want to go to Mexico. You know what I mean? I want to learn about that history that I know is also my history. And so I wanted to learn the language so I could do that, so I could travel. That was my choice. And my friends were also Spanish speakers, so we all took class together. Like one of my best friends in high school was Puerto Rican. And so it was really nice to have her in class with us. You know what I mean? And those were my choices. But yeah, the curriculum was definitely different when I was in school.
Yeah, and so just some like behind the veil of like the school system and like the board school and the teachers, and then so I remember my mom talking one time where someone tried to criticize the Navajo language curriculum. You know, it's like, hey, why don't you look at the way Hopi teaches their language? They're really bringing it back and really integrating it into their students, and they're getting it and they're holding on to it and speaking it. And then some of the teachers were like, well, this is Navajo language and this is the way we do it. And it feels like some of the older ladies and the older teachers aren't taking criticism very well. Because, you know, like, oh, well, we teach them this. And it's like, but it's not sticking. There's something not working.
Yeah.
And you need to change it.
I mean, there's some great models out there. Like, there's Hopi, there's Mohawk, there's Maori, who've done some really great work in their communities bringing back their language.
And, like, I feel like if they just, like, because Navajo Nation can enforce their own curriculum because they're sovereign, or so they say. Or so they like to say.
Can. We just need a leader who...
You just need to do it. You need to sit down and put the work in and create a new curriculum and say, hey, in all of the classes, have a Navajo thing. Like, you know, like, math, but with Navajo terms, like, you know, maybe once or twice a week. And, like, you know, because when you're in school and you have language learning or language arts, it's this whole thing. You have poetry, you have word and sentence structure and everything, and that's what Navajo needs. Navajo needs a really hardcore breakdown of the grammar, the sentence structure, different ways to create with the language.
You have to create an environment of it. It's like we said before, like learning how to think and see and feel and express oneself
because, like,
in the language.
When you look at, like, the different, like, school curriculums and their standards, minus Navajo, it's all interwoven. Like, you know, you have some math in your language arts, you have some language arts in your math, you have social studies, like, they all try to reinforce each other. So if you create a curriculum that also has Navajo mixed in, then you're forcing the kids to have the Navajo in their language arts and their social studies and their math and then their science, and you make it relevant and have them using it daily in every class.
Another big thing too is we need to normalize accepting those that are learning and not just be criticizing them, like, oh, you said that wrong, or laugh at them when they, you know, when they try. Because I see that way too often where people who are learning get criticized because, you know, and just get torn apart and torn down. And it's like, what the hell, you know, like, you're not supposed to do that. People are trying to learn. They're doing their best. They're using the words that they know in the context that they're familiar with to express and speak to others in this language. Why would you want to tear them down or make fun of them? Like, that's BS, and I think we need to stop doing that. Like, as a people, as a whole, like, we should never do that, because that's what discourages people, and that's why people aren't learning, because they get torn apart all the time, you know, they get made fun of. And I don't care what anyone says about, oh, you gotta be tough, you gotta, you know, like, deflect all that. It's like, whatever, like, we're in a learning phase here. If you look at, like, if you were to, like, align yourself with the growth phase and learning a language, like, I would probably identify as, like, maybe, like, a crawler, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not in the infancy phase. I'm at that point where I know a few things. I can kind of crawl along. Some people are toddlers, you know. Other people might be walking, but they can't run yet. You know what I mean? It's like we're all at this phase, these growth phases, where we're still very young. I know sometimes, like, in our singing class when we're learning new songs, the first songs we learned were Zithbean. These are the mountain songs. And after we learned Zithbean, we were like, oh, we graduated from kindergarten, you know what I mean? And then we learned some other songs, like Hoanbean. You learn Hoanbean, and then after that I was like, oh, cool, we're, like, in first grade now, you know what I mean? It really felt like these little baby steps, you know what I mean? Even though we're grown adults who have college educations, when it comes to the language, we're still at this very young phase, you know what I mean? This very, like, this lower
and, like,
level.
Even my aunt, she's taking like Navajo language class at like a school, but it's hard for her because she has no one to practice with. And, like, if you take anything, like, from reading a book and you see a word you're not really familiar with, but you just, like, kind of read over it, if you don't say it out loud, if you don't hear other people say it, if you don't see it in multiple contexts, it's only always going to be in your head, and it could be correct or it could be wrong. So having the environment and people to talk to with the language, and then also people who can help you, like, if you say something wrong, they correct you and help you say it correctly without being mean about it.
And another thing too is, like, there are like, when I was talking about the spectrum of fluency, there's also different dialects within the language.
Definitely.
They're regional dialects, but there's also a different kind of language for people who are Hatathli, like singers or medicine people. There's different kinds of dialects for people that are educators. There's different dialects for people that are Nabahi, like warriors. There's different dialects for people who are Natani, our leaders. And so they have different languages set for them. There's even different languages and vocabularies for people that are hunters. You know, there's certain songs and prayers and identifying words for different beings. And there's what they say, like an everyday language, and then there's also a sacred language. And so it's a very, like, it's very layered, you know, it's very multi-prismatic. And so that's why I think it's really rude and disrespectful when people start, like, tearing certain people, like, tearing each other down. It's just, like, stop doing that, you know, like, be helpful rather than hurtful.
One thing I had to, like, make a comment about is, like, I did a paper in college about KTNN and how they changed the way they speak Navajo to fit the radio style. And I always felt like they shouldn't have. They should have changed the radio style to fit the Navajo language because right now most people hear the way KTNN people speak.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the only context they have for how Navajo is spoken. And I don't know, that I don't think it ruins it, but it alters the language. It alters the sentence structure. It alters the flow of how it's supposed to be spoken because they're trying to get a quick 30-second sentence out that probably should have taken a minute or two to say.
Yeah, and there are people who do shortcuts too in the language, and I think what that does is, for those that are trying to learn, it makes it more difficult because they're learning portions of a word rather than the entire word. Therefore, when they're trying to speak like that, there's others that are just like, what are you saying? You know, like they're not hearing it in its entirety. It's almost like you're speaking in an abbreviated format. So it makes it more complicated too. And one of the DJs I was talking to was saying that they don't actually consider themselves fluent, even though they're considered to be fluent by people who listen to the radio. And this person's taking classes to learn the language because they're like, I don't consider myself a Diné speaker, even though that's their day job. Yeah. So it's really interesting, because you can perform it, I think, sometimes, but are you also, like, I feel like that's kind of where I'm at sometimes when it comes to, like, saying my clans, you know, my introduction. I kind of feel like it's a performance because it's a set structure. So I try to change it up a little bit every now and then, now that I'm learning more words, to customize it to my own, to customize it to myself, you know, to have my own identity be a part of it. And I don't like to stick to the script if I can help it. So I don't know if that frustrates people or not, but I'm just like, yo, this is me. So, next question.
I think, mine are all, like...
Why, this one?
Yeah, so when Adrienne presented this topic with me, it really hits a nerve in, like, people attacking me and why I don't know the Navajo language. But it's like, why don't we have a system set up to help us learn the Navajo language? Like, why aren't there more children books? Why aren't those books in the schools? Why aren't there more educational shows with Navajo? We have a couple of them, you know, like you see the little puppet show that's trying.
Oh yeah,
trying.
Pete Sands' group. Yeah.
Trying to be created, and then we have that Silly Billy little kid cartoon, and people are like, well, why don't we have Navajo language? Like, why aren't you guys supporting these things? You know, why hasn't that puppet show been approved and airing and broadcasting somewhere for all of us to reach it?
Like, we need people to fund that or subsidize that.
Yeah.
It needs to be a priority. It can't just be like,
oh, that's a cute little thing they're doing.
Yeah, or like, why can't we do this? It's like, no, fund it. Like, don't just talk about it. Fund it. Make it. Let's create institutes, language institutes in every region of the Navajo Nation. Let's fund our Diné College programs. Let's provide more, like, budget lines for language speakers who can teach others. You know what I mean? Let's incentivize that learning. Let's put it in every school. Make it mandatory that every Navajo student speak Navajo for a certain, like, an hour or two a day while they're at school. Like, make it mandatory, because we don't do that right now. You know, we say we have all this power, we're so sovereign and so whatever, but it's like, why aren't we using that to bring, you know, all these different opportunities to our people? Like, why are we not prioritizing it? Because people like us, we get criticized. We get barred from certain opportunities. We get told, like, oh, you can't be this or that because you can't speak the language. We get told that we can't be a good influence in our community, or we can't be a leader because we don't speak the language. Or, you know, there's all these different criticisms where, like, I've been in chapter houses speaking to people, and when they ask me to speak the Nepazad, and I try, and sometimes they'll just shut down, like, oh, you can't, so we don't want to listen to you. You know, you get dissed and dismissed, basically. And I don't think that's right. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely not fair because it's not our fault.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to some extent, it's like, oh, well, you can go back and learn it. It's like, yeah, but at the moment, I know I'm not good at learning language.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's going to take me a long time to be able to learn it. But then once I learn it, I have no one to speak it to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my husband's Hopi. He kind of knows a little bit of Hopi, but not much. But, like, I have no one to speak it to.
Like, to practice with?
Yeah, they're like, you need people to practice with, and you need, like, you know, how to speak properly in, like, an actual conversation with other people. And so I have no one to do that with.
Yeah.
And
Like, for me, I started taking classes. So I started working at Dina College, and as an employee, we get kind of like a discounted rate for taking classes. So I started taking Navajo language classes. I actually put myself on a professional development plan to learn how to speak Navajo while I'm employed there, so that it will improve my ability to negotiate, share information, and, you know, really be a leader in the community so I can do my job better. So I started taking classes. It was great. I was taking singing classes and language classes, learning how to read and write in Dinepazad. But then the pandemic hit. And when that happened, we went to it wasn't hybrid classes. We went to online immediately. So for half the semester, we were in person. And then all of a sudden, the school shut down completely. And we had to go online. And a lot of the faculty and the students were having a hard time transitioning. It wasn't the same because before, in class, we would do these exercises where we would talk to one another and we would ask questions, and we would answer, and we were learning how to count and do math and describe things. And we had an amazing instructor. His name is Roger Benali. If you ever have an opportunity to take his class, I suggest it. He's a really good teacher. But it was hard to transition, and so I decided for myself, because my husband kept taking classes online, but it just wasn't the same.
Some people can't, you know. Some
it's
thrive
not the same.
in person. Some people thrive online. Some people, doesn't matter. They can do both.
I need in person.
Yeah,
that's what I'm getting at. So I haven't enrolled in any classes yet. I did try to enroll in some weaving classes, but that's something completely different. You know what I mean? But the language classes, I'm not going to start enrolling in them again until they're all in person. So that's where I'm at right now. The problem with this last semester was I just didn't have time. You know, like, I'm super stretched thin, and I just didn't have the time to do it. And I don't project I'm going to have time next semester either. So that's one of the barriers to my success. And I do appreciate the question, though, because it's a good question. You know, our audience wants to know.
It's definitely a tea topic. You know, it's like...
It's definitely a hot tea topic, and it burns. It's burning us right now. Just kidding. Why doesn't the Navajo Nation gear their educational system with more Navajo language incorporated into all school subjects?
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about. Is like how all the other school curriculums and their, what are they called? Standards. They all interconnect and interweave with each other. So why can't the Navajo Nation develop their own educational school standard that interjects Navajo language into all these classes? And this, I feel like I'm able to come up with these critiques and these questions because my mom was a teacher and I was there helping her a lot in her classrooms, and I'd hear these discussions with other teachers and get all, like, you know, the juicy details between, like, school board members and everything. So it's something the school, like, the Navajo Nation could do if they just tried. You know?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's been initiatives, like missionary initiatives, where they were aiming to have every household on the Navajo Nation have a Bible in their home. What if we did that with a Dinepazad dictionary? You know?
But
like, what about funding for that, you know?
Also, one thing I wanted to say was, like, I feel like a lot of people, the people who make it, like, they're, like, really proud about, like, oh, our voter thing is in Navajo.
Yeah.
Or, like, these pamphlets are in Navajo. But from what I've experienced and what I've seen, the people who don't understand the English written word aren't going to understand the Navajo written word. Because they don't read Navajo. They speak Navajo. And so having the pamphlet in Navajo or English doesn't help because they don't read.
It's a skill, yeah, and it's a skill you mostly have to go to college for now to learn how to read and write Navajo. Or I think they might do it in high school now, but I know for sure in college you can. And like my mom, she is a fluent Navajo speaker, like I said, but she can't write it or read it.
Yeah,
it's very challenging.
It's not. It's not something that was written down when they like. Yeah. So if they don't understand English written word, they're probably more than likely not going to understand the Navajo written word.
Yeah.
And so I always feel like I'm like, well, that's. You put all this time and energy for creating this pamphlet or this voter registration. Who's it helping? I feel like it's just a boost to you guys. Like, oh, it's in Navajo now. But the people who can read the Navajo probably were fine with the English. And the people who can't read English need someone to talk to them in Navajo.
Like I said, the people who can read and write are often high school and college graduates, where a lot of our grandparents didn't finish high school because... you know, for various reasons, not high school or college, you know what I mean? So, like my grandma, who's passed on now, she didn't graduate high school or go to college, and that was the norm, you know? So it's really, I don't know, I know there's a good amount of people who have, though, a lot of our grandparents out there now that have gone to college, and that's great for them, but we're just saying, you know, that sometimes the reading, writing, speaking, they're not all in alignment. And it's like, who are these tools really helping, and how can we provide resources so that we can, you know, that help is there. So, yeah.
So I feel like this discussion can go back and forth. So don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and we can further this discussion in the comments below.
We shared our stories about why we don't speak Navajo, and identity is so closely tied to language. So what does it mean when someone doesn't speak their native tongue? Post it in the comments below. Thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye.